Gentlemen, welcome to the video and welcome to the channel. If it's your first time here, if you found this video, you might have just put a shot on a really good deer. And if that is the case, congratulations, you should be proud of yourself, as that is not any small feat. But now is where the real work begins. The results of your hunt are largely going to hinge on the shot placement of that shot, so we're going to be talking about how a deer will react to different shot placement, how your arrow will look, and how important it is to find your arrow, and then subsequently how to track that deer after the shot. So stick around, we're going to break all this down in this video. So before we dive into specific shot placement, I want to talk about three big factors that you need to keep in mind at the moment and a couple minutes after the shot itself. You've done all this work, the deer comes in, you take your shot, and you hit your animal, and then personally, I used to just black out. I didn't retain a whole lot of information in the moment, and it made tracking a little bit harder. So there are three key things you need to keep track of after the shot happens. Number one, where did your arrow actually impact? Being able to spot your hit is one of the biggest reasons that I kind of push people to try to use lighted nocks if their bow shoots them well. I have an entire video on the channel about lighted nock usage, whether or not they're worth it, and the pros and cons. If you're interested in that concept, I'll leave it linked in the cards right now. But generally speaking, spotting your impact is going to give you the answer to the big question, which is, how do I go about tracking this deer? How long I need to leave it in the field to minimize the risk of bumping it out of its bed and maximize the chance of actually recovering my animal. So if possible, try to spot your impact. We'll get into what an arrow will look like based on different impacts a little later in the video, just in case you either didn't see where your arrow hit or the animal carried the arrow off with it. Number two is to log mentally the reaction that deer had to the shot. Did it take the shot and jump up and mule kick? Did it drop and take that shot really hard as if you hit bone structure? Did it walk away and sort of hunch up and act sick with some tail flicking that would suggest intestinal shots? Things like that. Also, exactly what trail did it go down? Where's the last spot you saw it? And where can you realistically guess that that blood trail is going to start? A visual signal on where that deer went is one of the easiest ways to get sort of an early start on your blood trail as well, especially if you're hunting in thicker areas where you can't see quite as far. Being able to see exactly the gap that that deer went through is extremely valuable too. So pay close attention to the deer's body language and the route it takes to get out of there after the shot has been made. Third and final bit, after the shot, you need to make sure that you are listening very carefully. I hunt a lot of thick areas. I don't hunt a ton of open fields or ag country, and therefore, once I shoot a deer, it's typically out of sight fairly fast. So using your ears to listen for the deer crashing, the direction the deer went, and any other information you can get about the deer's activity after it moves out of the area. Is it stumbling around? Do you think you heard it crash? Did it somehow circle behind you where you couldn't see it, but you know you heard it behind you after the shot? Things like this are going to be very valuable. So once you've taken these things into account and sort of mentally logged them, it's time to go look for your arrow. I typically give it a minimum of a half an hour before I climb down and look for my arrow. There's two reasons for this. The first reason is, right after I make a shot, personally, I have a ton of adrenaline running through my body, and I am likely to misstep on my climb down, fall out of my tree stand, and break my legs, and nobody wants that. Second reason is, if the animal is somewhat close by and still within earshot of you, and looking back to where the shot actually happened, trying to figure out what's going on, you are more likely to spook it if you get down sooner rather than later. Now we're going to get into the actual protocols that I use based on different shot placements. Before we do that, I do want to caveat this and just say that I am assuming full pass-through shots from one side to the other with your arrow sticking in the ground on the other side or hanging out of the animal or whatever. I assume this because it's just one consistent factor that I can sort of isolate out as a variable, but just make sure that you're shooting durable arrows with a very durable and reliable broadhead on the front, and you should be okay for getting decent pass-through percentages on a white-tailed deer. Also keep in mind that these are just based off of my personal experiences and the way that I do things. People might have different systems, people might have had different experiences, but I think that overall the themes that I'm going to give to you in this video are going to average out to fit most people's situations very, very well. The problem with basing literally all my hobbies around wild animals is they're very, very unpredictable. So you might experience something slightly different than what I'm putting forward here in this video, but again, it should fit fairly well. Now we're going to be moving through these shot scenarios from best case scenario to worst case scenario, and the double lung for me is the best case scenario possible, simply because it is one of the fastest ways to get that blood pressure to drop and get the air out of that animal so that they can't run very far and they don't have to suffer very long at all. It's extremely fast, and there's a ton of large vascularity up through the center of the lungs towards the front of the animal, and I typically recommend aiming for a double lung shot because it gives you the largest margin for error. The lungs on a deer, the size of the target's about 10 inches, and just a really easy thing to aim at and nice and easy to remember as well. So we're going to talk about 4 aspects of every shot. Number 1, how the deer is going to react. Number 2, what your arrow is going to look like once you recover it. Number 3, how long you should give that animal before you track it. And number 4, what that blood trail is theoretically going to look like. Double lung reactions can be a bit variable, but generally what I see is either very little drama, where they just take the arrow and run and kind of get out of dodge, or possibly something like a mule kick, which I've typically seen to be a really good sign in all of my experience, or literally no reaction at all. I shot a doe a few years back that I hit double lung straight through the center. She stood there, got wobbly, and fell over. Literally went 0 yards, had no idea what happened. When you find your arrow, expect it to be a bright red, but not quite a deep red. It's almost like a pinkish red, very bright colored, almost like it's a glowing red color. There's also going to be aeration inside the blood, as that's kind of the entire function of the lungs. The blood coming out of there is going to be aerated, so it's going to have bubbles in it. It's going to be a really, really good sign that you hit lungs. It might be kind of foamy on the fletchings, things like that are something to look for. Typically on a double lung shot, I'm only going to give the animal a half hour to an hour from the time of the shot to start tracking. It's a very, very lethal shot, and the decreased lung capacity makes it a little bit harder for them to run very far as that blood pressure is dropping and they're starting to expire. They're eventually going to lose consciousness and go down probably within about 200 yards. The blood trail itself should be fairly reliably decent. Obviously, blood trails are a big variable. People will argue that this broadhead gives a better blood trail versus this one. Typically, I haven't seen much of a pattern that I'm able to connect between any broadhead type or any broadhead brand. The biggest thing that does connect to a better blood trail is going to be broadhead sharpness. So consider sharpening your broadheads if you have the spare time. For a pressurized organ like the lungs, that fluid is going to be kind of blowing out the sides of those 2 wounds on the side of the deer. Every time they take a breath, it's going to be pressurizing and depressurizing their chest cavity, and that's going to be pushing blood out the 2 sides. So it'll look kind of like somebody took a paintbrush and like flicked paint out to the sides of that animal down the trail that it's going on. It'll be more like little flecks instead of like large droplets. That is a good indicator that you've hit a lung shot, and that animal should be very, very close by. Simply follow that trail up to the animal that's most likely going to be either within sight or in some thick bedding areas, somewhat close depending on where you're hunting, and you should be able to find it no problem. Okay, let's move into heart shot. I put this one second on the list because it's not something I necessarily aim for. I typically aim lower third right behind the shoulder on a whitetail, but it's something that if I catch it, I'm obviously very excited about it, and it's going to be extremely lethal for whitetail deer. So number 1, the reaction from the animal is usually going to be a mule kick or taking that shot and just getting out of the area very, very fast, very similar to lung shot. Your arrow is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be covered in a thicker, more deep red blood. That's going to be your arterial blood. It's going to kind of hold its shape a bit more than a lung blood will, which is going to be slightly more watery, but not as watery as something like muscle blood. So that thick blood that kind of sticks to the shaft of your arrow, that is something that is very indicative of a heart shot, and that deep red color tells pretty much the same story. Same concept as the lung shot as far as timing goes. I'm typically giving them a half hour before I start tracking them. If I find an arrow that has that heavy arterial blood on it, it gives me a lot of confidence they should be very close by. And as far as blood trailing goes, it's going to most likely be a decent blood trail considering the heart sits low in the chest cavity. Your blood is not going to have to come up very high before it starts coming out of the entrance and exit wounds, which means the blood trail should start fairly soon and should be fairly heavy. It's not going to be like flicking out the sides so much unless you hit the lungs and the top of the heart. It'll be more like heavy droplets, as if somebody was walking with the hole in the bottom of a bucket, just because that arterial blood isn't necessarily pressurized in the same way, but it can spray out the sides if you take both lungs and the heart. So those are the 2 ideal shots taken out of the way. Now we're going to move into something that is less than ideal but still very lethal, and talk about what happens if you hit them in the liver. Now typically I'll catch liver and lungs, but sometimes you can just center punch the liver only. Liver shot deer can either pick up and run very quickly to get out of the area, or they can take the shot and sort of hunch up and look almost sick or uncomfortable and start flicking their tail as they sort of wander away, looking back, trying to figure out what happened. It's a really good indicator that you're going to have to give that deer time, but it's also a really good indicator that that deer is fatally hit. Liver, stomach, intestine shots are all lethal hits. They are not survivable long term for the animal. The only thing that's actually going to drop your chances of recovery is you as a tracker. If you bump that animal out of its bed, especially in the dark when you can't make a follow-up shot or anything, it is going to severely decrease your chances of finding that animal, as they've probably already stopped bleeding and now are displacing from you even further. Your arrow is going to be sort of similar to a heart shot arrow, but it's not going to be aerated like a lung shot arrow. So it's not going to be bubbly, and it's going to be a bit thicker than something like muscle blood, but it's going to have this kind of maroon burgundy sort of hue to it. It's definitely not going to be a bright visible red, so much as like a darker red, almost leaning into like a purple color. This is a really good indicator that you have hit liver, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something you have to treat differently than heart or lungs. For a liver hit, I'm typically going to recommend a minimum of 2 hours wait from the time of impact until you start looking for that deer. If you have the time and the temperatures are right for it, anywhere below 45 degrees, I would recommend actually waiting 4 hours, get out of there, go take lunch, go relax, and come back in later. If predation is a big deal in your area and you don't want the coyotes getting to your deer, typically taking that trail the deer took for a little while after recovering your arrow and leaving like a jacket or something that smells like people in the area is a great way to keep coyotes off of your game. That's like a little trick that I learned a couple of years ago, and I've used it in the past for one of my, actually this buck right behind me. I had to leave him overnight from a shot similar to this and left my garment in the woods so that coyotes wouldn't make their way to them. So that's generally what I recommend for a liver shot, 2 to 4 hours, leaning on 4 if you have the time. Blood trail on a liver shot is going to be actually kind of similar to a heart shot. It's not going to be spraying out the side. It's going to be this slow drip as if it was dropping out of a pail of water. And it's just probably not going to be as heavy as something like a heart or lung hit. It's going to be a little more sparse, and it shouldn't drop nearly as much volume, but a lot of that bleeding is going to be internal where you can't necessarily see it. So don't panic if the sign is light, and also don't panic if the sign doesn't start right away. You might go 50, 75 yards with no blood, which is why the visual tracking on your animal is extremely important, so that you can kind of skip that dry section of the blood trail at the beginning and jump straight to the last point you saw them, where you should pick up blood fairly reliably. And again, a liver hit deer will simply not make it. You are going to recover that deer. The only thing in your way to not recover it is going to be you trying to rush this process. So just, again, calm down. Take your time, track very slowly, keep your head on a swivel, take a few steps, look around. Keep an arrow nocked in case you have to finish the deer off once you find it. Again, these shots are not ideal. We all are aiming for heart and lungs, but things like this happen. But the most important thing is that we can remain ethical and actually recover this animal. So again, just be patient. You're going to find a liver hit deer just fine. Okay, now we're moving into sort of the questionable, you're going to feel bad about yourself for a couple of days type shots if you end up making them. We're going to move into a stomach hit or paunch hit deer. The point is, the stomach is one of those areas on a deer that, again, is going to be very lethal. They are not going to survive this hit, but it's going to take a little bit more time. So let's talk about the reaction to the shot. Expect it to be pretty similar to a liver hit. They're going to take it pretty easy because it's all soft back there, no ribs to go through, not a whole lot of pain involved in the actual point of impact. So they might just take the shot, sort of hunch up and move away a little bit and look back. You're going to expect them to start hunching their back, acting a little bit sick, like they don't feel so good, and flicking that tail between their legs and tucking it in. They're then going to wander off into a bedding area, and over time, they're just going to expire. Now, this deer right behind me, I ended up doing this exact shot on, backed out, went back the next morning, and he was laying 60 yards away in the first bed he made. He just went to sleep that night and simply didn't wake up. So that's a general reaction to the shot. Let's move into what your arrow is going to look like. Typically, the arteries and veins around the stomach are going to produce a decent bit of blood on your arrow. I found that usually it's a greenish sort of stomach matter substance mixed with a little bit of blood, which actually is a good thing to see. It means that you did hit something that's a bit heavier in arteries than things further back from the stomach. We really don't want to get into that area, but we will talk about it soon. So if you see a greenish color on your veins, definitely leave the arrow where you found it to mark the position and back out of the area for a few hours before you go back in. I know it's going to be tough to wait this long, but I would genuinely recommend a minimum of a 4-hour wait before going after a stomach hit deer. This is one of those areas that simply doesn't bleed externally very much at all. I've been through 3 stomach hit track jobs now, one of which was mine, the other of which were not. And every time we found the deer fairly close, but every time there's been very little to no blood. Don't panic. their first instinct is going to be to go chill out somewhere they feel safe, and that's where they're going to eventually expire. But again, 4 hours minimum. Honestly, I kind of like overnight or like 8 hours at a maximum, right? Because we don't want to leave them out so long that, again, coyotes or spoilage is going to get to them. But regardless, 4 to 8 hours I think is a pretty fair window to wait before going after a stomach hit deer. As far as tracking tactics go, again, the initial visual tracking that you do on that animal after the hit is going to be almost more important than the blood trailing. The blood trailing is going to be like sort of a dark colored liquid coming out, or actual stomach contents, unfortunately, and that's not going to be super consistent to follow. It's going to be a pretty rough track. So what I typically do is, if I have buddies that are with me, I will follow the main trail that that deer took the last time I saw it, and if the trail ever splits, I'll send one of my buddies down the split, and I will remain on the main trail. If I have somebody else with me, he and I will remain on the same trail. If we reach another split, the third guy will take that split. And that's pretty much how I do stomach hit tracking. If that doesn't work, I recommend grid searching in pretty much every direction at like 25-yard increments, either with a party or by yourself. And if you waited long enough and that deer did bed down in the bedding area that you've chosen, you will almost always find that stomach hit deer, no problem. I'm going to say it again for the sake of repeating it. Patience is key in this process. You have to be patient or you're not going to find this animal, because it's going to detect you coming, and it's going to have enough strength to get away from you one more time and put enough distance between you and that deer that you might just never find it. So take your time, grid search if you have to, and I think you'll most likely find a stomach hit deer. Okay, now we're going to move into the worst case scenario while we're still including organs in this discussion, and that's going to be a gut shot animal. Treat it exactly like a stomach shot animal, just give it more time. So instead of a 4 to 8 hour window, I would recommend an 8 to 12 hour window before you start tracking it. The arrow itself is going to have more of a brown or black colored substance on it, not so much green, meaning that you've moved from the front of the digestive tract where their food is still, you got the greenish color to it, to the rear of their digestive tract where it's starting to turn that brownish black color. Again, blood trailing is going to be very, very sparse. You might have some right at impact just from the muscle around the area, sending a little bit of blood out with your arrow, but other than that, it's going to dry up pretty fast. Now, I've only tracked one gut shot deer in my life personally, thank goodness, but we did end up finding her about 300 yards away down the path of least resistance. From what I could tell, she walked out of there very, very slowly and showed the same signs as if she'd been hit in the paunch or stomach. And once we found the arrow, it had that brownish substance on it, which is a telltale sign that unfortunately you hit back in the guts and you're going to have to wait that 8 to 12 hour period before you go and get her. Grid searching is going to be extremely valuable here as well. Typically following that path of least resistance is going to get you very, very close to the animal. Just breaking it down into a grid with you and some buddies if possible is going to give you your best chances. All right, let's move into spine shots now. This is going to be a fairly short portion of the video. If you hit a deer in the spine, it's most likely going to disrupt that thing's central nervous system. You want to immediately follow up with another arrow through the pump house, through the lungs, through the heart, at whatever angle you can squeeze it in there. At this point, a secondary arrow can only be a positive effect, because that animal might recover from the disturbance to its spine and its central nervous system, and then be running around out there with an arrow sticking out of its back, and nobody wants that to happen. So follow up immediately as fast as you can. Keep your quiver close by so that you have that follow-up arrow, and you should still be able to get your deer. Spine shots happen, deer drop. Every time a deer reacts to an arrow, it never moves the impact lower. It always moves its body lower, which moves its impact higher. So spine shots are something that happens. Unfortunately, it happened to me this year as well, and just something you got to make up for immediately. So I hit this buck in the spine. Actually, it's my most recent video. Killed the biggest buck of my life. I'll leave it up in the cards right now. But I did end up hitting him in the spine, and then about 10 seconds later followed up with a second arrow, and his entire experience of expiring there was about inside of a minute. So about as ethical as you can get. Just unfortunate that that first arrow did impact a little bit too high. So that's all I really have to say about spine shots. Final spot that we need to talk about for this video is the scapula. So scapula shots are generally going to slow your arrow down, but if your arrow is built correctly, you should be able to make it into the vitals. And the good news about a scapula shot is that it basically shields the most valuable vital organs in a deer's body, the heart and the lungs. Also, as you move forward towards that front of that deer's body where the scapula lives, all the vascularity is heavier, which means that if you get through and maybe impact that opposite shoulder or almost impact that opposite shoulder, that deer is most likely going to be dead very, very close to where it would have died on a heart or lung shot. Now, if you get shallow penetration, you maybe find that you've only got 6 to 8 inches of penetration on your arrow. If you're lucky enough to be able to find it, you're going to want to give that deer time, because now it's probably only hit single lung, and in some of the vascularity, you're going to want to give it a few hours before you go look for it, just for the sake of caution. If that arrow buries still fletching, go get your deer within a half hour to an hour. It's hit just like it was hit in the lungs or heart. The blood trail on a shoulder hit deer is generally going to be more sparse than something like heart and lungs, just because you've got more structure around the entrance and exit wounds that's going to be blocking the drain of that blood out of the chest cavity of the deer. And if you only have one hole from that shoulder slowing down your arrow, it's also going to slow down the rate of bleed, which is then going to make for a more sparse blood trail. So just be prepared for that. But again, if you got enough penetration through the shoulder and it's not too high in the body, you should still be able to recover that deer fairly close. Okay, so that is every shot placement taken care of that is really worth talking about. One key factor to also consider is shot angle. If you're taking a quartering to or a quartering away shot, the general rule of thumb is to assume the worst. So let's say that I enter at about lung on the left side and I exit stomach paunch on the right. I'm going to treat that as a stomach or paunch hit if I find green residue on the arrow, even if it's mixed with frothy lung blood. Why do I do this? There's a chance that maybe I only caught one lung, maybe I only caught the liver, or a little bit of lung, and they're going to need longer than a double lung shot. And there's really no negative side to waiting a little bit longer if you can spare the time. So just treat it with the worst case scenario, meaning if you hit really hard quartering and you went in at stomach and you exited up front near that offside shoulder, I'm going to give it a couple of hours just to make sure that the way that I kind of calculated that angle in my head is reliable and is going to get up into that heavy vascularity towards the front of the animal. So just assume the worst, track it as if you only hit the worst part of the deer that you ended up making contact with, and that is going to keep you out of trouble on those quartering shots that you might have pictured slightly different in your head, but actually landed differently on the animal itself. So that's pretty much going to cover every viable shot placement that's going to get you your deer and how I like to track them after the shot. So other than that, I'm going to go ahead and let you guys go. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.